Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Welcome, everybody. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here on freedomslips.com. And I'm honored to have as guest with me for the next 2 evenings, author Gary Wayne, who's written and released a 814-page, I believe, book, a compendium on the ancient mysteries and prophecies and mythologies of the world and how they come together in underlying truth. I most certainly recommend it to people if you've not had a chance to get it and to read through. It certainly is a task to read through it. I've been reading it for several weeks now, and I only reached page 400 or so. So, Gary, are you there?
I am, and so excited to be back on your show tonight again, Zen.
I'm looking forward to it, and like yourself, I've had received a lot of good feedback from everybody, and everybody seems to be excited when we get together to share fellowship, and so looking forward to the ongoing series.
Yeah, should be good. Should be very good.
Excellent. Well, before we get started, let me give you a chance to give out your website contact information and where people can go to support your work.
So if somebody is looking to purchase my book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind, it's available through Amazon.com and all Amazon sites around the world. It's available through BarnesandNoble.com and through their stores that can be ordered through there. It is also available on most online websites, and it's also available in Kindle format, also available through Christian bookstores, as it's distributed by Ingram's and Send the Light Distribution, and thereby you can order it through an independent store as well. If somebody wants a personalized, autographed version of my book, go to my website. That's www.genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6, conspiracy.com. And you can go to buy from author, or buy now, buy from author, and I can personalize it in any way that you wish to. And there's also generous excerpts of my book on the website if you're interested in viewing it a little bit deeper before maybe purchasing. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Gary Wayne 63. That's at Gary Wayne 63. And also on Facebook, I have a Gary Wayne page and then 2 Genesis 6 conspiracy pages. And if you do get a hold of me, I will get back to you.
Excellent. Well, I have another question for you as far as your radio interviews, because I know that you do a number of them, probably weekly, even daily almost. Do you have a central site where people can go to find the links to all of that?
Well, I have a number of on my website. I don't have them all up there. I do post them all on my timeline. I've been setting up a YouTube channel. I actually have it. I just haven't transferred all of the interviews there, but I hope to do that in the next little while.
Okay, so if people follow you on Facebook or befriend you on Facebook, then they'll see all the links for those, right?
Yes, and even if you just Google Gary Wayne and Genesis 6 conspiracy, you'll see so many of the interviews come up. So,
Right, yeah.
But absolutely every interview I post through my timeline on the Gary Wayne Facebook, and I also I put them out on Twitter as well.
Excellent.
And on Twitter, you could follow it by just following the hashtag Genesis 6 conspiracy. That's where my interviews will be.
All right, excellent. Well, since we are before a new audience, Gary and I have been doing shows on my other radio program on Truth Frequency, and I do recommend that people go and listen to those two shows. They are posted on my YouTube site under Endeavor Freedom. Very profound discussions, and it's going to be a follow up on those two this evening. So, Gary, can you kind of give people a general overview of what your book is about, the focus, and what you are trying to bring forth as message through it?
Sure. It's a book that begins in Genesis 6 with the creation of giants and the descendants that they create thereof, how they partner with the descendants of Cain, how they partner with the mystical religions and the seven sacred sciences and the secret societies that rise up around the Nephilim and the descendants of Cain in assistance and partnered with the fallen angels, how they usurp the kingships and the government and dominate the antediluvian world, which brings upon the world the first apocalypse known as the flood. How these organizations and descendants cross the flood, how they affect the early post-diluvian period places like Sodom and Gomorrah and Babel and the Exodus and many and much more, how they've affected our history right up to our present time and what they're doing today, what they're planning to do, and how they're going to bring about the end time and present the dragon Messiah. So in a nutshell, it's a 6,000-year connect the dots investigation into the descendants of the Nephilim, which I call the House of Dragon.
Excellent, which is most certainly one of my most favorite topics. As far as the underlying truth of all things seems to be connected to it as topic. Even as crazy as it sounds, with people wanting to deny there being any truth to dragons and dragon lineages and reptilian beings, this certainly is the strange esoteric aspect of how truth portrays itself once you really dive deep into it and investigate it in the world mythologies.
Absolutely, and the connecting thing from prehistory to the end time is essentially our Redeemer Jesus, who talks about the days of Noah and the end time, that they'll be the same. And so we need to go back and understand what happened in the antediluvian epoch so we can understand what's going to happen in the end time, because nothing is new under the sun, and these things keep cycling them all the way through. And so we can learn what happened in prehistory and right after the flood, and actually many other accounts throughout history, to understand how the end time is going to come about. And have a bit of a saying, it's the in the antediluvian world they had the Nephilim world order, and I think the NWO that everybody talks about for the end time might be more accurately described as the Nephilim world order as opposed to the New World Order. But
Yes.
that's just sort of one of my idiosyncrasies.
Yes, absolutely. And just to catch people up to speed, in the last two shows that Gary and I have done, we covered in great detail the antediluvian age and its connections to the earth becoming without form and void, destroyed, and how in Genesis you have a restoration and a recreation of the earth. And so we're going to pick it up there and go ahead, Gary. I want to give you a chance to speak about how these seven secret sciences were brought forth. And we'll start with the modern era, the fall of humanity, and then the birth of the two bloodlines, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent.
Sure. And most people will maybe not be aware of what the seven sacred sciences are in terms of how it plays a significant part in prehistory, but they'll know the names of those sciences because they're being developed again today, and everybody's taught them in university. But the core to the seven sacred sciences and the mythology, it goes back to what the craft legends talk about, and Freemasonry is absolutely inundated with prehistory and the development of these seven sacred sciences. So for the most part, I base a lot of what I have to say about the seven sacred sciences from the craft legends, and then sort of bring the context around in the book and in interviews when I'm talking about it as to how those sciences manifested themselves. And so as it goes, is Adam was taught all this knowledge in Eden, but after the fall, he continues to practice and teach the seven sacred sciences, and he teaches them obviously to Cain, one of his sons, and Abel is murdered by Cain, and then Cain is ostracized, and then Adam also continues to teach it to Seth. So we have the progression and the applications of these sciences taken on by two different people, and they'll take two different forms. And so Cain in turn teaches his first son Enoch, as opposed to Enoch, son of Jared, in the Sethite line. So let's not confuse the two here. And so Cain and Enoch develop these seven sacred sciences, but they start to develop them in a way that is designed not to respect the God of the universe or to honor him in any way or to honor him as the creator of the universe and to lead people astray. And then they pervert these sciences to honor their God, which is the great architect of the universe, and or Satan or Lucifer or whatever you would like to call him, and the fallen angels that followed them. And so they develop a mystical religion and secret societies to house these sciences and to keep them away from who they feel are mundane and not worthy of understanding these knowledges, including how you become immortal in these sciences. And so they create these initiatory organizations and religions that remain today. And so Enochian mysticism is basically sun worship, and the sacred societies, the original sacred societies would be Masonry. And so these sacred sciences were developed at a significant level, and to a level that exceeded in, I think, when we look at some of the other mythologies, to a level that was higher than what we have today. And so when we look at what was going on in the antediluvian world, we have to look at how these religions and this technology and this knowledge was helping to corrupt the antediluvian age. And, you know, for people who maybe aren't aware of what these sciences are, I'm going to list them here for them. But I'm going to give other people some other names that they'll know them by through history and through mythology and other sources, whether it's from the Rosicrucians or whomever. But it's the hidden vaults of Enoch, and Enoch hid 9 vaults stacked on top of each other with 36,525 books that survived into the post-Diluvian epoch. You might also know them as the Pearls of Wisdom. And of course, these are the pearls of wisdom that are hung from Azazel and Rosslyn Chapel, as I recall, and in a form of an S or a Z. You might have heard of them as the Archives of the Masons or the Emerald Tablets, or you might have heard of them as the Golden Fleece or the Hall of Records or the Tablets of Destiny or the Golden Apples, or the Rainbow at the end of, or the Treasure at the end of the Rainbow, the Shatia, and on and on and on, the Tablet of Ham, the Tablet of Hermes. There's so many names to this bank of knowledge that they're talking about, and it's all the same thing. And so these 7 sacred sciences are known as grammar and rhetoric and dialectics as the first 3. And those are the ones that teach. Grammar teaches people to write and to speak properly, and it helps mold minds through reading. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion. Dialectics is the discerning of falsehoods. Now, these 3 combine to their greater science, which is called philosophy. And that's reserved for the real elite, and it's what they teach in university today. And philosophy is believed in this perverted system that it is superior to the 7 sciences because it is the arbitrator and the one that harmonizes all of the other sciences, and it unites them to create the absolute science or the absolute philosophy of science or the supreme ideal, as they may call it, or the Unitarian conception. And out of this absolute perfection of is the development of the human spirit to become immortal and to become like gods. And also alchemy comes out as a byproduct of the absolute science, and that technology as a sort of ultimate development enables the golden age in prehistory. It will enable the golden age as they're trying to bring about in the not so distant future, and it also has the ability to destroy the world. So it's very, very powerful technology developed, and it's philosophy that governs all of this. So now when we get into the other sciences, it's arithmetic, or the development of all of the math to a level of absolute incredible levels that they did in the past, is what we're starting to do today. Geometry, which is the fifth science, also known as masonry, because this is the one where they do the architecture from. This is one where they create the monuments to honor the ancient gods and honor the gods even today. And then there's music, and then there's astronomy. And so it's not that these names are so enlightening, it's the development and accumulation process of what they did in the past and what they're doing now that's going to corrupt the world, that will make it like the antediluvian epoch.
Excellent. Well, nice synopsis. And everybody knows, especially those that are listeners here, knows that I attribute that the line of Cain was evil from the very beginning, and that the reason um, for that was because he was a hybrid son of the devil. I know not everybody agrees with that assessment. I think you have inklings that definitely there was something strange and weird about the children of Cain. His whole, his name meaning acquired, which would be sort of like a stepson, the way you acquire a stepson. But no matter how they became corrupt and became evil, it seems most certain that the rebel angels, the fallen angels, Lucifer, the one third that joined him in rebellion, that are counted as evil, they were most certainly working through this particular line. And so, can you talk about where things got corrupted? If they were to receive the teachings from Adam, well, most certainly they would have been given um, by him as being in a pure form, meaning that they were taught to worship and to honor the Most High God. And then they shortly, very quickly fell away. And if you would talk about Cain's, Cain's life, his sons, and his lineage, with that regard.
Sure. And everybody will know that Cain was ostracized for murdering Abel. But what most people maybe don't realize, although it's probably you can make the extrapolation, is that Cain never repented of his sins. Cain never went back to God to continue to worship God and ask for forgiveness. He continued in his rebellion, into his rebellion in all sorts of other avenues. And once he started to have his family and his descendants, then, as Josephus would mention, is every generation of Cain's lineage became worse than the previous generation. So if Cain was evil, you can only imagine by the 10th generation how evil this generation had become, and by the seventh generation, the Cain lineage had, in partnership with the Nephilim, had totally corrupted the Seth lineage, except for a very, very few people, and of course Noah would be one of those. And so Enoch develops and teaches and essentially establishes all of the constitutions, all of the new rules, records it in books, and he creates writing. He's accredited by not only the Orientalists but the Freemasons for establishing or creating or first writing hieroglyphics to record this information, and the initiation rituals and the new religion, this new sun worship religion that is going to house this religion in the secret societies. And then there's a sort of this slower development by the sixth generation, the descendants of Cain and Enoch with Lamech, things start to pick up because Lamech and his progeny, they really start a new sort of resurgence and a new sort of evangelizing of this religion, and this resurgence really takes the technology to a whole new level. And people might remember some of these descendants of Lamech, and again, I'm talking Lamech of the Cainite line and not Lamech of the Seth line, because the names are very, very similar in each of these bloodlines. And so some of the names that are mentioned in the Bible are some very, very key proponents or patriarchs of Freemasonry, and those would be Tubal-Cain and Nama would be the two biggest ones. And Tubal-Cain is considered the greatest artificer of metals and a grand master and a master craftsman. And Nama, she's not really mentioned a whole bunch in the Bible, but in other sources we'll find out that she did work the sciences, but she was notorious for marrying giants or perhaps even mating with fallen angels. And the other two are Jabal, who is closely related to music, and then Jabal, which is closely related to Masonry and its development. So there's this steady progression of evil all the way in its application, and this manifests itself with the Nephilim in the sixth generation, and the Nephilim come in and they usurp the kingship. So now you have a Nephilim order of kingships that are enslaving the humans of the antediluvian epoch, and you have this Atlantean wizard, magi, magic, seven sacred sciences, polytheism, sun worship religion that partners with the Nephilim and the secret societies and the continual development of all of these arts and sciences to totally corrupt the world. And we see the application with fabulous monuments, perhaps like the pyramids or Stonehenge and Machu Picchu and all these sunken cities that are off all of the coasts around the world, and absolutely inexplicable and unaccountable as explained by secular science, because they're trying not to acknowledge that this history that actually did take place. And we also see hints of that's recorded in the Bible on how they corrupted the whole world with this technology. So you can imagine DNA manipulation and crossbreeding of animals to create these fabulous beings of prehistory that we only get a glimpse at, whether or not it would be a Pegasus or it would be a centaur or it would be an elephant headed Nephilim or God, or it's the elves and the fairies, or it's the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch, or it's the little people and the fairies. There's so much of this manipulation of DNA and these creating of what Enoch would call the reprobate spirits, or false or counterfeit spirits, as well as the Nephilim. That is also going on in the antediluvian world. And I would also suggest that this would include the disruption or the changing of the genomes of plants and everything that's on the earth. So similar, again, what we're seeing today. So when it says in Genesis that the whole world was corrupt, I think they're talking about the whole world, and this is an outcome of the seven sacred sciences.
Yeah, even Berosus, in one of the quotations that Polyhister makes of him, because we only have his work being extant in other people's quotations of him, but he mentions as to creatures like the hippocentaurs, he speaks about winged humans and half man, half creature, half serpent, half man type entities. And so there were all these different hybrid type creatures, the Medusa and Gorgons, harpies, unicorns, all these really fantastic and mythical type of creatures. But then you also have these crazy monstrosities and one-eyed cyclopses and all kind of mentions of beings that are no longer found and accounted as far as history. But it's my opinion that the reason that is because they were hybrid, and so they could not replicate. And so after their initial lifetime, you would find them disappearing, and then also with the flood, it was to wipe out much of these monstrosities and to uh, clear the slate for humanity to have chance to come up in, without having to worry about being eaten by something.
Yeah, and it sort of also perhaps answers a couple other questions about the flood account in the Bible. We note that Noah was not only pure of heart but pure of lineage, and his lineage is accounted for in the Bible, and so he's utilized from a Sethian perspective to repopulate the earth after the flood. And it's also interesting that all of the animals that are going to be on the ark are sent to Noah by God, two by two for
Right.
unclean and seven pairs for clean. And I think that's again suggesting, this is a little bit of my speculation, but it seems to make sense that God sent them animals that perhaps were not corrupted to repopulate the earth, and that's why they were sent to Noah. And also, it obviously makes it more probable and likely that that they could be, as opposed to rounding them up and trying to go all over the planet to round them up. So that makes a little bit more sense of the story to me. And only representatives of the species or kinds, which is, if you take that back in its Hebrew, would be more properly translated as we understand it today as species. So not every animal was put on the ark, just ones that could repopulate those species after the flood.
Right. Yeah, there's a particular extra biblical text. I don't remember his exact name, but I do remember that in the context of the story, it speaks about the Most High God sending these creatures to Noah, and that they, went on board the ark and everything in a very non-aggressive way. All right, we'll be right back, everyone. Welcome back, everybody. I'd like to share really quick a passage from the text called the Wisdom of Solomon, which speaks about the Israelites during the Exodus when they were basically attacked by what everybody thinks to be snakes or serpents. That it's my opinion these particular snake-like beings, these Nakash, that they were very different from what people really think or consider as far as being snakes. It says this: in return for their foolish and wicked thoughts, which led them astray in worshiping irrational serpents and worthless animals, thou didst send upon them a multitude of irrational creatures to punish them, that they might learn that one is punished by the very things by which he sins. For thy all powerful hand, which created the world out of formless matter, did not lack the means to send upon them a multitude of bears or bold lions or newly created unknown beasts full of rage, or such as breathe out fiery breath, or belch forth a thick pall of smoke, or flash terrible sparks from their eyes. Not only could their danger exterminate men, but the mere sight of them could kill by fright. And that's from chapter 11, the Wisdom of Solomon. So these particular beings, whatever they were, they could breathe fire or belch a pall of smoke or exterminate by their sight, which sounds much like what the powers of the Medusa, the Gorgons, they were said to be able to turn men into stone and kill them by fright. And so Very interesting passage. Gary, you kind of comment on that?
Yeah, and I would also note that not only were the Israelites being attacked by these strange, aggressive, violent, fire-breathing um, serpents, but God saved them through utilizing a serpent that he put on a pole.
Right.
And so, I mean, demonstrating that the whatever these beings are, and I'll touch on that in a second, that the power of God, He can even take their own symbols and their own forms and use them against them because He is absolutely omnipotent. So, there's a passage in Isaiah, that's chapter 6, where the word seraph appears, and it's the only variation of seraphim or seraph that we get in the whole Bible, and that connects actually back to this account in Numbers that you're referring to. That these snakes are attacking the Israelites, and they're called venomous snakes, and I think it's also recorded in Deuteronomy 8 as well, where they're talking about these snakes. And what's interesting about the connection is that seraph is a venomous snake, and a snake is nakash, like you say when you go back to cherubim, and that the angels are the watchers that ruled the ancient world, and the ones that weren't imprisoned for their sexual sins against humanity into the abyss were called seraphim angels. These were the watchers of the antediluvian world, and not all of them were imprisoned, because only the 200, as Enoch counts them, that went to Mount Hermon, who had sexual relations, were imprisoned in the abyss for the violation against creation. So I find it interesting again that we have these seraph description of snakes that are attacking the hope of humankind in Israel to bring the Messiah. We have the snake that everybody connects with Satan as the great dragon and the great serpent, and we have the snake that's used in Eden for the fall of humankind. And I think
Right.
all of this is connected. And we also note that these seraphim angels were they looked like a viper. And that's why seraphim and seraph are connected. And we don't get that connection other than the description of Satan as a serpent and a dragon. And if you can imagine a dragon having wings and the face of a snake, then you have a flying dragon, right? Or a flying serpent, which is
Right.
sort of the same imagery. And so if we go outside of the text, or if we go to other depictions of these fallen angels, these watchers, these seraphims, they are loaded with describing them as serpents. So the Sumerians called their god serpents, and they called their offspring serpents as well. And they're talking about the Anunnaki, and they're talking about the Nephilim, and we're talking about the Titans, because the offspring look just like these seraphim angels, their fathers. And there's a passage in the origin of the world, the Gnostic gospel. So and I use outside sources for context here, but it refers to the antediluvian watchers as serpents,
Right.
and they describes them with long and narrow faces, and prominent cheekbones, and elongated jawbones, and slanted eyes, and thin lips. And so then when we look at some of these sculptures out of prehistory, where we see these elongated skulls, and we see these sort of protruding chins and these high cheekbones, and they're very snake-like looking depictions, everything just sort of comes together that these celestial mafia were viper-like beings, and so everything that's snake-related was Satan, and Satan is a serpent in a seraphic form, although he's also known as cherubim as well, which is probably the only being that I know that has the ability to be two. but he's definitely known as a serpent in Revelation and a dragon. And he also takes the form of a serpent, or he does an avatar like possession of a serpent in Eden. You can take that verse whichever way you want, but he's utilizing serpents for the fall of man. And so we have this seed of the serpent that's talked about in Genesis 3, whether it comes through the seraphim angels and their offspring, or if there was an offspring of some of the Canaanites as being acquired. And there's lots of Gnostic sources that suggest that could have happened in several different ways. There's this war that is going on with these serpent-like beings and these serpent-like offspring with the descendants of Adam, and that is so important and so core to remember.
Oh, I think it's absolutely key. Because, in my opinion, if you don't understand it that way, then really you miss who our enemy is, and all of these other illusions, as you mentioned, with the connections with Genesis 3, the seed of the serpent, the Revelation 12, the dragon, that old dragon, the devil and Satan, who deceiveth the whole world, the flying fiery serpents. I mean, the cockatrice. I mean, there's so many
Sure,
allusions to
and
these particular. Go ahead, Gary.
well, I was going to say, and the image in Revelations that speaks like a dragon. How many times
Right,
Jesus said vipers, and you speak like a snake or a viper? Those are not loosely used terms or descriptions. They're there to give us an understanding of what is really going on.
right, and who our enemy is, and that there is this ongoing war. Because even in Matthew 13, where he tells us the parable of the sower and the parable of the kingdom and the parable of the wheat and the tares, he speaks about the enemy that snuck into the garden, allow both to grow together until the time of the end, that the wicked one is the father of the tares, and that the devil is the enemy, the wicked one that snuck. I mean, there's so many allusions to this ongoing war between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, which also connects to what we will be soon going into at some point, is the war of Israel and the giants, the sons of Anak and the Anakim, the Amalekites, and all of that. So,
Yeah, and
can you reference that
I
too?
wanted to underline as well, if I could, Zen, is that, and I know the listeners, they're probably starting to think about this as we talk about all of this snake and viper and serpent and dragon imagery. Is this answers the question when you look at all the other ancient civilizations and they had a polytheist religion, why they're absolutely inundated with dragons and serpents.
Yes, exactly.
It is inexplicable that is everywhere around the planet if their gods weren't closely related to dragons and serpents, and they express the imageries and their religions, and dragons and serpents are all the way through. And even if you go into the Egyptian religion with the cobra. I mean, the cobra is absolutely a key element to the iconology of ancient Egypt, but it's everywhere. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you go to China or Central America or Southeast Asia. It matters not where you go for the legends. They all talk about these serpent gods. And they were definitely the watchers, and I would call them the celestial mafia of that time.
Absolutely. And as you said, when you do your research into the antediluvian in the prior times, you have everywhere the worship of these feathered serpent beings, which, in my opinion, that's exactly what the Nakash was. And there's several passages which allude to that, and the connections, with the dragons, who are also feathered, winged snakes, winged reptilian serpent-like entities. And so all of these connections just can't be, just loose associations. I mean, they are absolutely speaking about and referencing, in my opinion, the same thing. And when you make those connections, things really start to plug into place as far as the puzzle of truth.
I agree.
Well, let's go ahead and take this up to the Genesis 6 and let you speak about that incursion and then the further corruption. And then we'll go through the flood and then, speak about the Nimrod, the Tower of Babel, and then the after the flood continuance of evil and the seven sacred sciences.
Yeah, so I mean, we get a picture of what's going on in Genesis 6 of the flood, but what people may not realize if they don't connect it is Genesis 6 is not only the flood narrative, but it's also the Nephilim narrative. And there's nothing to separate the Nephilim narrative from the flood narrative. So it's the same narrative, and it goes right from the description of the sons of God or the Ben Elohim going to the daughters of men and producing Nephilim and heroes of old and men of renown, and then it goes right into the flood story. And this in itself connects to the violence that and the corruption that had overtaken the world in the days of Jared. And so in the sixth generation, in the time of Jared, in the lineage of Seth, is when the Nephilim come about. And so we've had this tremendous development of the sciences up to that level, because if you recall what I said earlier, it began with Adam and then to Cain and to Seth. Seth developed it for good, Cain developed it for evil. So we have 4 extended generations, even from the point of looking at from Enoch on. So it has had a very long period to develop. And then at that same time in that generation, all of a sudden, all of this knowledge starts to explode into incredible levels, and it partners with the Nephilim kings, and then the Nephilim kings become absolutely corrupt and violent and start making war not only against humankind, but against the planet. And they are violating the planet, they are violating the animals, and they are violating the plants, and they are violating human beings. And what that means in the complete manner, I'll let that go to your imagination, but you can imagine they were violating all of creation in manners that were not all that pleasant. And they also started to slaughter humankind.
Right.
Because humans were not able to feed them as much as they wanted, and the giants were realizing that they were no longer going to be immortal, and so they started to take their avarice or their enmity or their wrath out on humankind, because it's the humans that are going to be raised above angels and thus raised above the Nephilim in the future world, which is why Adam was created. And so this revenge continues, and they start drinking the blood of humans, and they start to eat humans. And the level of corruption and violence of not only of the life forms, but the debauchery and the cannibalism and the polytheism and the sexual orgies and the things that were going on were just absolutely astounding, that it got to a point that it made God grieve. I don't know what it takes to make God grieve, but it must have been awful. And it was all accelerated by the ability that these sciences and this knowledge had brought. It wasn't just, as you might see in Conan the Barbarian, this sort of ancient society with swords. Yes, that is an allegory and a story of the antediluvian epoch. And in the original one with Arnold Schwarzenegger, the evil king that he's chasing actually turns into a snake. So,
right,
another perfect allegory there. It was these giants and these powerful beings with all of these other types of beings like little people and all these other things that are running around, plus the religion, plus technology that was likely greater than ours, because certainly the monuments that they built are greater than what we can build, because we can't build them to last that long. We can't do it with that amount of expertise and masonry and joinery, and to be shock resistant to last not only through time but through earthquakes and the flood. I mean, the technology is just absolutely astounding to me, and I wonder how much further it is than what we have today. But I also know that we're closing in on that type of technology rapidly, especially when you get into quantum mechanics and quantum computers, which make supercomputers look like a digital calculator from 1971 or 1972. So I think we're very much approaching that. But understand, all of this has come together into a culture and a society of black magic, and the dishonoring of the God of the universe, and the worshiping of these watchers and these fallen angels, human sacrifice en masse, Nephilim running amok, Nephilim warring with Nephilim because there's wars going on between various factions of these world centers, and there's at least 4 civilizations of the antediluvian epoch, as many as 7 to 9, depending on which mythology you want to look at. And in the Atlantean mythology, Atlantis is the one that is trying to create a world government and is only defeated by an alliance of other titans, including Theseus and Hercules, to stand against the Atlanteans. And so this is a world that was supposed to be a golden age in the beginning, where everything was beautiful and in a utopia that quickly deteriorated into dystopia and an absolute horror and nightmare. So I'm kind of hoping that I'm giving a description as to what this world was like, and to the point where if you didn't worship the religion of mysticism, because the Nephilim enforced this world religion, and they persecuted the people who didn't. And that's why all but Noah, by the 10th generation, who had basically submitted to this. I mean, you can imagine what was going on with the Gestapo or the KGB or the death squads in Central America. Well, this would be sort of a similar analogy of what's going on. If you didn't worship the true religion that they said was the true religion, and not the monotheist religion that we know of in the Bible, you're either going to be persecuted, slaughtered, or enslaved to do servitude to them. There was only 3 options, and most people capitulated.
Yeah, even like during Nazi Germany, how everybody supported Hitler and accepted his dictatorship and began to get involved in many ways with the government that was established to rule over all those people, and we see that reflected in Last Days Babylon, and it's mentioned in Revelation and the coming world government, the Antichrist taking over the beast system, and so um, we've got just about 4 minutes before break. Can you just comment really quick on that, and then we'll pick up on the other side?
Yeah, so nothing is new under the sun. And so
Right.
when you use the Nazi analogy, it is just the replaying. You have the occultic religion, and most people are starting to realize now that Nazis were very much occultic, and they have replaced the Christian Church with the Reich Church in 1933. And this included the Vril and the Volkisch ideology, and the Vril is something in the blood that goes back to giants. Thule, which is part of the religion, was their Aryan Atlantean mythology that goes back to giants, and they've overlaid their Volkisch ideology with real ideology, and real is a Rosicrucian ideology, into this religion, and it's kind of a show in itself. But just to give people a quick idea,
Right.
and Hitler is the Messiah of this church, and they also take Jesus to be blue-eyed and blonde because they say he was lied about by the Jews, and they devalue him to a prophet status. And so we'll see this in the end time. And in any of the regimes, you will see this marrying of this religion with the dictators or the potentates or the Gibberim or the Nephilim, because it's a similar sort of allegorical term that's used all the way through, and we're going to see that in the end time. If you take Napoleon, or if you take so many other aspects of history, we're talking about the same story with the same religion, and it's always occultic, and it always um, slides into Holocaust and genocide.
And just so the listening audience knows, we will take our time in going through the story, and when we get to the different aspects of it, we'll elaborate in great detail upon all of those segments. And so, um, just stay tuned for the series, because we're gonna try to cover all aspects of it. And so when we return from the next break, we'll pick up with the Tower of Babel. Unless you want to elaborate some more on anything with the Genesis 6 incursion, anything to do with the giants, and then we can move into the Nimrod and the Tower of Babel and the focus of all of that.
Sure. So
Hold on, Gary. We'll be right back for second hour, everyone.
I say only they help us through. Sweetheart. Hello, this is Jan. Yeah, so. What you saying? The only way out is through.
Okay, guys, stand by. We'll be right back after the break.
I have a comment, period. You know the saying, comma, the only way out is through? Yes, I am enjoying that show. Who is the speaker? Question mark. I was calling in to make a comment, but now I have the Revolution Radio recording, period. Not sure if I have the right call-in number. 310-421-4053. 310-421-3053. Yes, period. I understand.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Gonna share with you just really quick a story from a Sangoma named Kreta Mutwa, and he's talking about these rebel angels when they first arrived here to the earth. It's an interesting story, and it'll kind of set the stage for what we're gonna talk about in this segment. He says, but when the Chitta Uri, which are the names of these dragon-like entities, arrived in Africa, they told our people that they were gods and that they were going to give us human beings great gifts on one condition: we had to worship them and accept them as our creators. Some told our people that they were our elder brothers and that this earth had produced them generations ago. And they said they had come back to the green womb of their mother, and that they were going to make us also into gods. Jabulon, which interesting name, interesting word, sir, is a very strange god. He is supposed to be the leader of the Chitauli. He is a god, to my great surprise, which I find certain groups of white people especially worshiping. We have known about Jabalon for many, many centuries, we black people, but I am surprised that there are white people who worship this god, and these people amongst them are people whom many have blamed for all the things that have happened on this earth, namely the Freemason people. We believe that Jabalon is the leader of the Chitauli. He is the old one, and one of his names is the African language, sir, is Umbaba Samhonga, the Lord King, the great father of the terrible eyes, because we believe that Jabalon has got one eye, which if he opens it, you die if he looks at you. Any comment on that, Gary?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many commonalities to not only what other cultures talk about, but what the Bible talks about. So I think it sort of stitches together a number of common things, and one of the things that it mentioned there, and it sounds like a little different time frame, but it's these seraphim watcher dragon rebellious angels who organize the people of day 6 into civilizations
Yes.
and give them civilization and teach them the knowledge, and they inherit the cities and develop them. And so in exchange for food, they worship them, consistent food. They worship them and they do the work for the gods, and then they teach them how to be agrarians. And this is also seemingly where I think where Cain comes in and becomes king over some of these, at least one of the civilizations anyways, and some of his other descendants may have moved on to other antediluvian civilizations. But it's just sort of a retelling of the same sort of story where it's these fallen angels that have created all the woes on the earth. And before the break, I was going to talk about just quickly one other point in Genesis 6 that I think we need to keep in mind as we move forward, is that these Nephilim, who look just like the seraphims, with the face of a viper. I mean, these were monsters. These weren't just large people. In the account, so the older ones are 20 to 40 feet tall.
Right.
But certainly they also had a width that was quite a bit bigger than the ratio of humans on their height to width ratio. So human will have a 3-to-1 ratio on average of height to their width. Well, these ancient Nephilim had a 2-to-1 width, so they were very broad, and they were absolutely monstrous with muscles, and they were quick, and they were adept, and they had the face of a snake, and they had a long neck, and their eyes glowed, and they were frightening not only to look at but to listen to, because again, you take this out of the Atlantean account, is their voice echoed like the echoes of Atlas out of a mountain. So they would bellow, and then the earth would shake. These were monstrous human beings that we just can't imagine their size and scale because of how big that they actually were, and what we would look like in comparison, other than the Israelites, who probably saw a more watered down version of what the original Nephilim were, said they looked like grasshoppers to
Right.
them, or insects. But the original Genesis 6 Nephilim, they received the immortal spirit, and then God steps in and limits the lifespan of human and all beings to 120 years after that, against this violation, because the immortal spirit of heaven is not to dwell amongst humans in the physical world to create physical gods. And so that was the violation against creation of this sexual violation that I was talking about earlier. And what's important about that is the bodies weren't immortal, so the bodies would die out. So the original generation of Nephilim, they would have either died or their bodies died, but their spirits didn't, or they committed suicide. And so these are the reprobate spirits that their spirits weren't permitted to go to sleep and they weren't permitted to go into heaven. And so these are the demons that people often talk about and confuse with the fallen angels. And these are the same beings that Jesus talks about in the New Testament. And the most famous aspect would be Legion, and they're afraid that he's going to send them to the abyss, where they're partners in crime in the antediluvian world which were the impassioned fallen angels. But this is a very important thing to remember as we move forward beyond the flood, that there are different entities involved. There's the fallen angels that are still here that weren't imprisoned because they didn't have sexual violations, because there was a third of the angels that rebelled. So only 200 went to Mount Hermon. We don't know how many more may have had sexual copulation after that, but not all of the rebellious angels went to the abyss with the imprisonment. And the demons are out there creating havoc on the people in the world. And this has been known for a long time. This is known as hero worship. That was known in ancient Greek mythology, where the hero would die in a local town or an area that he was ruling over, and he would be seeking to come back, as he would be so angered he would want to do revenge on the people that he ruled over because he no longer had a body. And so the spirit would come back and haunt them, and they used to do sacrifices and worship to him, all to pacify this angered god. The same belief is in Taoism, which is the forerunner of Tao. So this is a known sort of concept that has happened throughout history, and of course Enoch very, very clearly describes that these demons are the bodiless spirits of Nephilim. So keep this in mind as we move forward.
Right. It leads me to, I want to ask you a question about um, just humanity in general. Do you think that there was a difference between those of the pre-flood area and their lifespan being almost 1,000 years? Do you think there was any difference in their stature and their size in comparison to the people after the flood, and how the lifespan also reduced for humanity afterwards, after Noah?
Yeah, yeah, they may have been a little bit larger, but when we get accounts of Nephilim immediately after the flood, and particularly in around Sodom and Gomorrah and the War of Four Kings against five, I mean Noah is still around, and this is first few generations after the flood. So I don't think that humans were anywhere near the size of what the Nephilim were. They had a similar sort of long span, but it was shortening as the generations were going.
Mm-hmm.
So this seemed to have taken place to limit the lifespan to 120 years over a period of time. And so we even have somebody like Og, who is known as the last of the Rephaites in Joshua and Deuteronomy, and he can't be the last of the Rephaites because there's Rephaites that are in the Promised Land that we might talk about in a few minutes that Israel is going to conquer, but he is perhaps the last of the surviving Rephaites, or the Rephaim, out of the antediluvian epoch, and this is circa 1450 BCE, and the flood is somewhere, depending on who you want to talk to, somewhere between 2400 BC and 3100 BC. So this means that Og was by that age at least 1500 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even older. So I think that's the only thing that would be, in my opinion, that would be common in the physical traits. And certainly I don't see that Adam having any of that extra sort of physical nature being passed on. Now, if Cain was fathered by either Satan or fallen angels in whole or in part, because there's different aspects to that belief in other religions and mythologies around the world, that could have been passed on to the people of day 6.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to me too that the Kebra Nagas, that when it speaks about the whole story, elaborates on the Genesis 6, that it specifically cites that they mated with the daughters of Cain, that they took wives from the daughters of Cain. And so perhaps what occurred in Genesis 3, if something there indeed, which, of course, my belief is that there was something to all of that, but that maybe that is also why Genesis 6 was a possibility. And,
Well,
that,
it would have prepared them for it because they would have,
right.
in that analogy, they would have already been mating with the descendants or hybrids, however you want
Yes.
to look at that, of angels, and this would have been just sort of part of what their belief system and their genealogy and their culture would have expected. Um, so perhaps there was these other giants running around, and certainly in other mythologies, there's a lot more going on with creations of giants than the limited account that we get in Genesis. So as I said, there could be several different types of recreations, let alone the Cain incident, which is open to speculation in to a certain degree, anyways. And I know you're a proponent that he was the seed of Satan, but there's a lot of Christians that aren't really a fan of that. But as
Oh,
we noted earlier,
yeah, I know.
and what I note and what I note in my book is I can't rule it out because there is that connection with the translations of Genesis. What is it? Genesis 4
Right,
in
right,
the birth of Cain,
right.
where
In
his
the
name
Targum,
sounds like Cain, and then when he's begotten or he's born, that could be translated as acquired as well.
acquired,
So if you took it
right.
back to the Hebrew, so there is that, and then there's the Genesis 3 of who exactly are they talking about with the serpent seed? Is it the Cain incident or is it the Nephilim of Genesis 6?
Right, right.
All of
Yeah.
it comes together by the sixth generation anyways,
Anyways,
so it is
exactly.
this, yeah, it is the serpent seed no matter how it's formed, whether there's parallel or other pillars and lanes that happens.
Yes.
And and just as there could be possible violations or second incursions after the flood, I think that's open for speculation as well.
Yes. Yes, I agree. I wanted to ask you before we left the story of the giants before the flood, about Gilgamesh, the story of Gilgamesh, and also of the strange account of the creation of Enkidu, because and what you thought Enkidu was, and whether he was, some kind of artificial intelligence, some kind of hybrid being that was created. He was most certainly created to be a companion for Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh also being, one of these hybrid children born of uh, the fallen angels mating with the daughters of humanity, and his being concerned with his immortality. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's a very interesting story as well.
It is a significant story out of the Sumerian mythology, or Akkadian, or Chaldean, or whichever Mesopotamian, and whichever translation you want to use on it. But because it links a couple other concepts together, and kind of for me, it talks about how giants either survived the flood or because there's only three ways that giants can show up after the flood, and it's clear that in the Old Testament that after the flood, whether it's a Rephaim or it's the Emim or it's the Anakim or any of those particular, there's Avim or Avites. I like to use the word Im because it goes more consistent with Nephilim
Right.
as in one. So as to ites, which is more considered for humans as opposed to the offbreed of angels and humans. So somehow these giants survive. So there's only three ways that this can happen. One is giants somehow were on the flood or on the ark, or their DNA is on the ark. And I'm not as much of a fan of that because that would suggest that to me that the Bible is somewhat in error. In But in Gnosticism, they do believe in depending on which gospel you want to talk about, they'll have all of them as giants. They'll have Ham as a giant. They'll have Ham and Japheth as a giant, and many, many variations. And there's also a theory out there that the wives had Nephilim DNA, and that's how Nephilim start after the flood. But that certainly is one of the possibilities, and but it's not sort of where I lean, although I do recognize it as a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
The other two possibilities is humans and giants somehow survived the flood, and that is absolutely rampant around the earth in all of the other mythologies, whether it's on arks or climbing to the top of mountains. Most of the stories are giants surviving the flood, but there are around the world with humans surviving the flood as well. So that is a distinct possibility that fallen angels went to humans and to the giants and saved them. Now, when we get into the and in spite of what God's wishes were, but God is greater than their rebellion, and so it's just sort of part of the overall thing that has to take place. So when we get into the Epic of Gilgamesh, this one is uniquely different. This is the one that seculars like to defame the biblical account, suggesting that the Israelites copied their flood account from this Sumerian account. Well, on the macro level, the stories are similar. There's a flood, there's survivors, there's an ark, animals go on the ark, but on the detail level and the micro level, that's where the devil is, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just sort of talk about who Gilgamesh is. And he is a giant that survives the flood. He's obviously on this ark, even though he's the one telling the story to Enkidu or Enkidu, depending on which translation you want to take his name from. He is a survivor of the flood, and his name also comes up in the Book of Giants, and I'll even have a notation in my book as to which piece of the Qumran documents it comes out of the Book of Giants. Is Goliath is one of the giants that is forewarned in the books of Enoch about the flood, and so he is now one of the ones that survives. And he's described as 2/3 God and 1/3 human. So he's a demigod, and he's an Anunnaki, and he's a Nephilim, or a Titan, whatever you want to call him. But he is one of these potentates and military rulers and kings of the antediluvian epoch, and a family of the ultimate hero of this story, and hero is another word used for Nephilim, Utnapishtim or Ziusudra, again, depending on which translation that you want to talk about. But Gilgamesh is relaying the story of Utnapishtim and the flood story to a fellow named Enkidu. And Enkidu is created after the flood to be an offset to the evil of Gilgamesh because he's running amok. And so he is also described as 2/3 from the gods and 2/3 and 1/3 human. And his mother is trying to remember her name, but she's a mother goddess anyways. So I think this comes from a little different type of creation, or it's a second incursion that took place. But unfortunately, Enkidu doesn't fulfill his role to offset and protect humans from the evil of Gilgamesh. He actually becomes best friends with them, and they can continue to romp over humans in partnership now. So now we move on to Ziusudra and Utnapishtim, who is the Sumerian Noah, and we find out he's the archetypical Nephilim and a king before the flood, and becomes king after the flood, just as Gilgamesh was a king. And so this is a story of the telling of the survival of giants. And in with it, we have the third possibility, which is the second incursion of fallen angels creating giants again. And if we move over to the Greek version between Pyrrha and Deucalion, we have a similar connection to the survival of giants, because this again is said to be the Greek version of the biblical tale, and it's not, because Deucalion is the son of Prometheus. Now, Prometheus is both a Titan, Nephilim, and a god. So I'm presuming that the Nephilim was named after his father. But whether or not Deucalion is son of a fallen angel or a god or the son of a Nephilim, he's still Nephilim. And Pyrrha has many different names, especially in Gnosticism. And her name is also translated in some versions back to Norea, which is a variation of Nama, which again, if you go back to who we talked about, the four progeny of Lamech, Nama is the daughter. And Nama was known for marrying giants. So, and for possibly even fathering from a fallen angel. And she's also considered by the Gnostics to be the wife of Samael in some of their Gospels. So we have this connection where we have another ark flood story from the Greek mythology that suggests that giants survived the flood. But we also have the Titan rebellion, where these giants are imprisoned into Tartarus, and they escape after the flood into the Scythian range, which is a very significant area. And what's interesting about this account in the Atlantean account is that Poseidon is the one who fathered the kings of the Atlantean and the Nephilim and the Titans of the Atlantean Empire. And another name for Poseidon is Iapetus or Japetus. And so again, we can imagine a giant named after him escaping out of Tartarus and mixing in with the descendants of Japheth. And again, people would have us believe that Iapetus and Japetus is the same name as Japheth. No, this is a story of how the Titans survived the flood, and then they intermix with the descendants of Japheth, and maybe perhaps Japheth even takes on their name, as does Amalek does when he mates or joins in with the ancient Amalekites in the land of Seir. But certainly, Japheth's descendants, whether it's Gog or Magog, those are Greek names for giants, and Gog is Greek for giant. So there's a connection there. So when we talk about Epic of Gilgamesh and we talk about how the giants crossed the flood, I really like the Epic of Gilgamesh because it is telling a parallel story, in my opinion, to what the Bible is telling. One is a Nephilim survival story, and the Bible is telling a human Sethite survival story. And we also have a possible second incursion. So three possibilities. Giants somehow on the flood, DNA-wise, number one. Number two is a second incursion where fallen angels have recreate after the flood. And then the third one is that somehow they survived on arks or climbing to a mountain or some other ways that the fallen angels help protect them, because there's also an account in the Gnostic Gospels about Amakaseth, and he is taken into a cloud and protected from the flood. So lots of different ways in other accounts around the world how these people survived the flood.
Yeah, and in your book you mentioned that this would not, take or detract from the biblical narrative, because I believe you describe how we'll pick it up on the other side. We'll be right back, everyone. All right, welcome back, everybody, for final segment. What I was commenting on was that in your book, I believe that you speak about how the biblical narrative is focused and centered upon the Israelites as people, which of course you would see through the flood narrative, the focus on Noah and being pure in his generations, that is why we see him being saved through the flood in order to repopulate and repropagate humanity after the flood without having the concern of having to fight against all of these hybrid monstrosities. And also I wanted to get you to comment, Gary, if you would, on have you read in the Targum the story about the Og being saved and spared through the flood by being basically fed by Noah as well?
Yeah, that's also in Jewish legends and mythology
Right.
that he hung on to the side of the ark and he was fed. So whether or not that's true or not, don't know. It's certainly one possible way, but that would also, by that definition, to what most people believe is well, only the people that were on the ark, and there's only 8 that are named, survived. But what we do know is it's not in contradiction with Genesis 6, where it says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, in the days of Noah, and afterwards again. So we do know right from Genesis 6 that it's not. This is not a surprise, and to God, and it's not a surprise to the writers of the Bible that both had taken place. And also, when we look in the flood account, we're looking at what it says. If people want to get very specific, God was going to destroy everything that He created, except for those that were on the ark.
Mm-hmm.
The Nephilim and other reprobate beings, if they survived, were created by the Watchers, the Seraphim angels,
Right.
the fallen angels. And so, again, if people want to get that technical on it, then I would get that technical on it. But what I do know is that Genesis 6 foreshadows this survival, and then they show up after the flood. And whether or not it's Rephaim or it's Avim or any of the giant nations in the Old Testament that are listed, and there are many giant nations, none of them go back to the Table of Nations in Genesis or First Chronicles. And for people who aren't aware of what the Table of Nations are, it lists the descending families and names and progeny from Noah.
Mm-hmm.
And so none of these names, again, whether or not it's the Zamzunites or the Ozim and on and on and on, go back to the Table of Nations.
Right.
So where did they come from?
Right.
Well, they had to come from somewhere. So again, they either survive or there's a second incursion.
Right.
And these giants are around right from the beginning because they show up in Sodom and Gomorrah with the War of 4 Kings against 5, which is a war against essentially all giants by the Mesopotamians.
Right.
As the Sodom alliance there, they refused to pay their tribute that was imposed on them previous to that. So we also have other peoples that are listed in the Old Testament in the flood that survived the flood somehow because their genealogies cannot be traced back through the Table of Nations as well. And people may not be aware of that, but there's at least 4 or 5 at least 4 I think I can name. One would be the Gerzites and the Geshurites who lived with the Amalekites, and the Amalekites are another mystery. And then you have also the Machachites that lived in the area, lived alongside the Geshurites in the area of the Bashan where Og and the Rephaites dwelled. And these are peoples that, again, they're a mystery. They do not go back to the Table of Nations. So are they humans or are they descendants of Nephilim? There's also 2 other people that I'll mention, the Kenites and the Kenizzites. And Kenite actually defines, if you take that back into Hebrew, as a descendant of Cain. And
Right.
these 2 peoples have no connection back to the Table of Nations as well. So the Bible actually has several accounts of people that cannot be accounted for if no one but the 8 survive. And that's why I also go back that this is a Sethian account,
Mm-hmm.
and not necessarily some of the
Right.
other peoples that lived.
Right.
Right? And then if we match that up with other mythologies around the world, there are all sorts of legends about humans surviving and climbing to mountaintops or forming a log and writing it out that way or whatever. But I think we need to look at it in that manner, or because I don't believe the Bible is ever in contradiction.
Right. I agree.
What it does do is add to the information as it goes, and you need to understand that that's an addition to the story that you're given previous, but it is no way in contradiction.
Right. And then the other thing is that even though Og is mentioned as being the last remnant giant, we have Sihon, his brother, also
Yeah.
being mentioned afterwards, and in warring against the Israelites as well. And so he obviously survived as well.
Exactly, and Sihon is actually slaughtered in that battle just before Og gets there,
Hmm.
and doesn't survive. And Og's sons are slaughtered, but Og is not killed in this battle, so he continues to live on. I don't
Right.
know for how long, but he continues to live on. And the reason why I say there are Rephaim still in the Promised Land and other areas is because Goliath, and I'll connect him back in the Bible to being Rephaim, is, that's another 450 years or so, 500 years down the road.
Right.
And if we look at how the Bible lays out who the Anakites or the Anakim, the Rephaim, and the Nephilim are, it sort of works like this, which suggests that the giants that are amongst the Amorites and the Canaanites in the Promised Land are also, there's Rephaim in here. So here's how I get there. So we know from Deuteronomy 2, that Anak come from Rapha, or they're Raphaites. Okay, and then we know in Numbers that Anak descend from Nephilim. So then you take it back this way: is Anak, if they're Raphaites and they descend from Nephilim, you go Anakim, Rephaim, Nephilim, going backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, then the Anakites or the Anakim described in the Promised Land are Rephaim, which it says they are in Deuteronomy. Then Og could not have been the last of the Rephaim.
Right. Right.
Just simple sort of connect the dots and logic there.
Right.
And we know the Amorites were absolutely inundated with giant blood and DNA, because even though they're intermixed with the surviving giants or recreated giants, Amos 2:9 says the Amorites are as tall as cedars.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge.
That is.
And the Israelites described them as, they were insects or grasshoppers in comparison. And, I know in that Numbers account, there's probably some people out there that's going to say, well, that's just a bad report. You got to go back a few verses to know that it was the bad report that they're complaining about is not that Nephilim aren't real or Anakites aren't real. It's that this was supposed to be the land of plenty that God had promised back in, I think it was Numbers 10. That's what they're complaining about. And then if you read through the whole text of Numbers 13, that will become self-evident. And you can only say that Nephilim didn't exist if you ignore all the other accounts of the Nephilim in the Old Testament. So again, that argument doesn't tend to stand up under close scrutiny either. So
Not at all. I mean, there are so many accounts of giants all throughout the scriptures, even going up to Saul and David, and the five giants, the brothers of Goliath. To deny the presence of giants in the scriptures is, denying that there were giant bones found anywhere in the earth, which, that also in and of itself is so numerous. The evidence is overwhelming that most certainly giants existed, even in the native mythologies. The Paiute princess that spoke of Lovelock Cave, and how her ancestors had cornered the giants there, and killed, smoked them out and killed all of them. And then later, when they go in and excavate the backwater, they find all these giant bones. And you know about that story too, Gary?
yes, yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. And again, it's not a coincidence. I mean, wherever there's a flood story, and it's on all continents and over 500 cultures around the world, There are correlations with giants and other beings. It is all part of that same sort of world heritage or that world myth that the Bible is one. I won't call it a myth because I don't believe the Bible's a myth, but
Right.
it's all telling the same story with the same type of characters that are in it. Um, the other versions just tell it from a polytheist perspective as opposed to the Bible being from a monotheist perspective. So I don't find that as coincidence or not. And again, there's so many records of newspapers in the United States in the 1800s and early 1900s of all of these giant bones being found, and they're cataloged in these newspapers, and some of them have pictures, and some of them have drawings, and they all go to the Smithsonian, and they all disappear. Same thing
Right.
happened on the archaeology on Malta, where all these elongated heads and bones, they just all of a sudden they disappear after a time. Even in ancient accounts, like Josephus, which is a very good book for people wanting to know more on Jewish history and a companion of the Bible, and a few nuggets he has in here or there, said that there were bones on display even in his age, and they're on display in like a museum, and the bones were so distinctly different than humankind that they were like a different species. So they must have been a marvel to look at. But again, those ones disappear. And these giants, they're recorded right through into the Roman periods and further on. I mean, this is this is not an unknown sort of idea that there are giant bones and skulls around the world, but they all tend to disappear.
Right. Right. And then in the earlier, like a few hundred years back, some of the skeletons that were said to have been unearthed were in excess of 30 feet tall, which
Yeah.
to to the ones that are being discovered now, they seem to be somewhat smaller. But even recently in
Yeah.
Ecuador, there was a story of a couple of giant skeletons being put on display that were in excess of 25 feet. And so, I mean, that is amazing to imagine the stature. We're human beings standing beside a 25-foot giant would only reach up to their kneecaps. Um, i-
Yeah.
and it's wow, we can't even imagine the kind of the power and the
Yeah.
and especially with their being evilly inclined.
Yeah, and even when people look at Goliath, they say what 8 feet tall, 8.5 feet tall, but they're using a common cubit. If they were to use a royal cubit, and Goliath was a king of Gath, um, they would have used a royal cubit, which would have put him closer to 12 feet tall,
Hmm.
even at that point in time. And then Og, his bed was. Everybody again uses the common cubit and says it's still a little over 13 feet tall, but it's closer to 16 feet if you use the royal cubit. So
Hmm.
how big was Og? He could have been 14 or 15 feet tall, at least 12 feet tall, even if even if the kings didn't use the royal cubit, which I would find rather surprising.
Right.
Um, these were very very large beings, and so why couldn't the original Nephilim or the second generation Nephilim be 20 to 40 feet tall? But that tends to be the consistent sort of record that's out there.
Hmm.
And so these beings would have been well over 1,000 pounds.
Right. I just can't even imagine the kind of strength. Um, and then
Yeah,
the mention of the cedars, those are the ones that were in Lebanon, which were world renowned themselves and much larger than just regular cedar trees. And so definitely we are talking about a huge, very formidable foe, which is you can understand why when the Israelites went into the Promised Land and spied it out, why most of them came back just frightened and afraid to even go into that land and to take it over, even with the supernatural assistance of the Most High God, which they should have had, faith like Caleb and Joshua to trust in God. I mean, he had, supernaturally taken them out of the bondage of Egypt and out of that enslavement. And but it was absolutely intimidating to see the kind of people that were in the land.
Yes, which is why they required 40 years of discipline in the desert to
Right,
they'd grown fat or soft on polytheism in Egypt, and yes, they come through some very large miracles, but all of a sudden now they run face to face against the the giants in the promised land, and
right,
yeah, I think anybody who's on a path to God runs into that and isn't absolutely ground in spiritual development would probably run as well. And even after 40 years, I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, because people would have been being killed in these battles with Israel. They didn't go, without losing anybody, but to go up against these giants to take the promised land. Wow. And again, most people don't think about the promised land being absolutely inundated with Nephilim.
right.
And people don't then understand the context of what was going on with the slaughter and the eradication of the people in the promised land, because they were totally corrupted with Nephilim, and the whole land and everything was corrupted. They had taken the antediluvian corruptions and crimes and planted them in the place God had set itself for himself, and where he was going to raise the nation of hope. So the land had to be cleansed as what the
Cleanse.
earth had to be cleansed with the flood. And so critics of the Bible, mostly seculars and polytheists, say that God is a God to these innocent people. No, they settled there after the flood, knowing it was the land of God. And and if people don't understand where this comes from, when I say it's the land of God, it's the land He set aside in Deuteronomy 32, and it does say the sons of Israel, but there's the Septuagint and the Masoretic text says other gods and or angels. So you have to take that, or the sons of God, not the sons of Israel. That's where in the days of old, in generations long past, this is a pre-flood time period. God knows how far it goes back, because I'm not sure. But into the midst of time, the earth was split up amongst the watchers. And God always kept His own land, and that's why He calls it His land in His instructions, and He's giving it to the people of Israel. So the Nephilim, who were polytheists and were taught by these fallen angels and following this mystical religion that crosses the flood, they migrate purposely in great numbers to settle and corrupt God's land, waiting in ambush for the nation of hope to come to slaughter them from the face of the earth, just as the Amalekites, who are also another form of Nephilim, swore the blood oath to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. But what God does is He treats an eye for an eye equal justice, and He wipes the Amalekites from the face of the earth, and He wipes the Nephilim from the promised land, except for, at that time, the Avim or the Avim that are in the Philistine countries and the 5 cities, or the 5 Suranim, the 5 military alliance state of the Philistines aren't taken on, and that's for King David to take on after
Right.
Saul fails to fulfill his covenant obligations to take care of. And again, this is the time when the Amalekites are going to be wiped out, so that score is settled. And again, that they are told that when they choose a king and they've settled the land and they're doing well, then they need to finish the job. And it's all part of the king covenants.
Right, right. And again, without recognizing how this is interwoven into the fullness of the scriptures, really the most profound aspects of the story don't come to light for those that don't understand, that they were, going up and warring against these people, this hybrid race of cannibalistic, sacrifice their own children type of beings. Why, the Most High told him to wipe out every man, woman, and child. And without that understanding, as you said, people would consider that a genocidal commandment. But again, it's when you understand these things that it all makes sense. But Gary, we got 3 minutes
And
remaining.
and and it also brings meaning to Jericho, which I don't have time to go in with 3 minutes, but it brings understanding to the whole idea that they were going to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. So one was going to have to win, and Jericho was a foreshadow to what was going to happen in the Promised Land, done in a ritual, because this is an age-old city, the Moon City, a very, very, very important city that was resettled after the flood, that was in existence before the flood, and that's why God reserved it for special judgment before they took the rest of the land.
Right. Gary, we'll give you a chance to give out your website contact information one more time and where people can go to find and support your work.
Yes, so Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with a number 6. You can go there and you can find generous excerpts on my book and ability to buy from me for an autographed copy, or connections to Barnes & Noble and to Amazon from there, and to Kindle. And it's also available, the book is available on most online bookstores and through Christian bookstores and through independent stores. They may have to order it, but they can order it if they don't have it on the shelf. And you can follow me on Twitter at GaryWayne63 and on Facebook under Gary Wayne. And I also have 2 Genesis 6 conspiracy pages. And if you do contact me through my website or through any of these other social media aspects, I will get back to you.
Excellent. Well, Gary, we appreciate you so very much. And remember, everybody, that we will be bringing Gary on again next week. Final comment?
No, I think it's been a very, very good discussion. And I think we're going to have some people maybe contacting me or you and saying, are you sure about these people that said he says survived the flood? I'll look forward to that. But I think if we raise some curiosity for people to dig a little deeper, then that's what this is all about. Because once you start digging, then you're going to start to be awakened, and that's what this process is all about.
Right. And then again, when you research the mythology, and then it becomes evident with what we see reflected in the world as far as, the ongoing cultures and civilizations, their advancement post flood, it all seems to fit. Thanks, Gary. We'll talk to you again. God bless all. Good night. Of them, probably weekly, even daily almost. Do you have a central site where people can go to find the links to all of that?
Well, I have a number of on my website. I don't have them all up there. I do post them all on my timeline. I've been setting up a YouTube channel. I actually have it. I just haven't transferred all of the interviews there, but I hope to do that in the next little while.
Okay, so if people follow you on Facebook or befriend you on Facebook, then they'll see all the links for those, right?
Yes, and even if you just Google Gary Wayne and Genesis 6 conspiracy, you'll see so many of the interviews come up. So,
Right, yeah.
But absolutely every interview I do, I post through my timeline on the Gary Wayne Facebook, and I'll put them out on Twitter as well.
Excellent.
And on Twitter, you could follow it by just following the hashtag Genesis 6 conspiracy. That's where my interviews will be.
All right, excellent. Well, since we are before a new audience, Gary and I have been doing shows on my other radio program on Truth Frequency, and I do recommend that people go and listen to those two shows. They are posted on my YouTube site under Endeavor Freedom. Very profound discussions, and it's going to be a follow up on those two this evening. So, Gary, can you kind of give people a general overview of what your book is about, the focus, and what you are trying to bring forth as message through it?
Sure. It's a book that begins in Genesis 6 with the creation of giants and the descendants that they create thereof, how they partner with the descendants of Cain, how they partner with the mystical religions and the seven sacred sciences and the secret societies that rise up around the Nephilim and the descendants of Cain in assistance and partnered with the fallen angels, how they usurp the kingships and the government and dominate the antediluvian world, which brings upon the world the first apocalypse known as the flood. How these organizations and descendants cross the flood, how they affect the early post-diluvian period places like Sodom and Gomorrah and Babel and the Exodus and many and much more, how they've affected our history right up to our present time and what they're doing today, what they're planning to do, and how they're going to bring about the end time and present the dragon Messiah. So in a nutshell, it's a 6,000 year connect the dots investigation into the descendants of the Nephilim, which I call the House of Dragon.
Excellent, which is most certainly one of my most favorite topics. As far as the underlying truth of all things seems to be connected to it as topic. Even as crazy as it sounds, with people wanting to deny there being any truth to dragons and dragon lineages and reptilian beings. This certainly is the strange esoteric aspect of how truth portrays itself once you really dive deep into it and investigate it in the world mythologies.
Absolutely, and the connecting thing from prehistory to the end time is essentially our Redeemer Jesus, who talks about the days of Noah and the end time, that they'll be the same. And so we need to go back, and they did in the past as what we're starting to do today. Geometry, which is the fifth science, also known as masonry, because this is the one where they do the architecture from. This is one where they create the monuments to honor the ancient gods and honor the gods even today. And then there's music, and then there's astronomy. And so it's not that these names are so enlightening, it's the development and accumulation process of what they did in the past and what they're doing now that's going to corrupt the world, that will make it like the antediluvian epoch.
Excellent. Well, nice synopsis. And everybody knows, especially those that are listeners here, knows that I attribute that the line of Cain was evil from the very beginning, and that the reason um, for that was because he was a hybrid son of the devil. I know not everybody agrees with that assessment. I think you have inklings that definitely there was something strange and weird about the children of Cain. His whole, his name meaning acquired, which would be sort of like a stepson, the way you acquire a stepson. But no matter how they became corrupt and became evil, it seems most certain that the rebel angels, the fallen angels, Lucifer, the one third that joined him in rebellion that are counted as evil, they were most certainly working through this particular line. And so, can you talk about where things got corrupted? If they were to receive the teachings from Adam, well, most certainly they would have been given um, by him as being in a pure form, meaning that they were taught to worship and to honor the Most High God. and then they shortly, very quickly fell away. And if you would talk about Cain's, Cain's life, his sons, and his lineage, with that regard.
Sure. Sure, and everybody will know that Cain was ostracized for murdering Abel. But what most people maybe don't realize, although it's probably you can make the extrapolation, is that Cain never repented of his sins. Cain never went back to God to continue to worship God and ask for forgiveness. He continued in his rebellion, into his rebellion in all sorts of other avenues. And once he started to have his family and his descendants, then, as Josephus would mention, is every generation of Cain's lineage became worse than the previous generation. So if Cain was evil, you can only imagine by the 10th generation how evil this generation had become, and by the seventh generation, the Cain lineage had, in partnership with the Nephilim, had totally corrupted the Seth lineage, except for a very, very few people, and of course Noah would be one of those. And so Enoch develops and teaches and essentially establishes all of the constitutions, all of the new rules, records it in books, and he creates writing. And so they create these initiatory organizations and religions that remain today. And so Enochian mysticism is basically sun worship, and the sacred societies, the original sacred societies, secret societies would be Masonry. And so these sacred sciences were developed at a significant level, and to a level that exceeded I think, when we look at some of the other mythologies, to a level that was higher than what we have today. And so when we look at what was going on in the antediluvian world, we have to look at how these religions and this technology and this knowledge was helping to corrupt the antediluvian age. And for people who maybe aren't aware of what these sciences are, I'm going to list them here for them. But I'm going to give other people some other names that they'll know them by through history and through mythology and other sources, whether it's from the Rosicrucians or whomever. But it's the hidden vaults of Enoch, and Enoch hid 9 vaults stacked on top of each other with 36,525 books that survived into the post-Diluvian epoch. You might also know them as the Pearls of Wisdom. And of course, these are the pearls of wisdom that are hung from Azazel and Rosslyn Chapel, as I recall, and in a form of an S or a Z. You might have heard of them as the Archives of the Masons or the Emerald Tablets, or you might have heard of them as the Golden Fleece or the Hall of Records or the Tablets of Destiny or the Golden Apples, or the rainbow at the end of, or the treasure at the end of the rainbow, the Shatia, and on and on and on, the Tablet of Ham, the Tablet of Hermes. There's so many names to this bank of knowledge that they're talking about, and it's all the same thing. And so these 7 sacred sciences are known as grammar, and rhetoric and dialectics as the first 3. And those are the ones that teach. Grammar teaches people to write and to speak properly, and it helps mold minds through reading. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion. Dialectics is the discerning of falsehoods. Now, these 3 combine to their greater science, which is called philosophy. And that's reserved for the real elite, and it's what they teach in university today. And philosophy is believed in this perverted system that it is superior to the 7 sciences because it is the arbitrator and the one that harmonizes all of the other sciences, and it unites them to create the absolute science, or the absolute philosophy of science, or the supreme ideal, as they may call it, or the Unitarian conception. And out of this absolute perfection of is the development of the human spirit to become immortal and to become like gods. And also alchemy comes out as a byproduct of the absolute science, and that technology as a sort of ultimate development enables the golden age in prehistory. It will enable the golden age as they're trying to bring about in the not so distant future, and it also has the ability to destroy the world. So it's very, very powerful technology developed, and it's philosophy that governs all of this. So now when we get into the other sciences, it's arithmetic, or the development of all of the math to a level of absolute incredible levels that understand what happened in the antediluvian epoch, so we can understand what's going to happen in the end time, because nothing is new under the sun, and these things keep cycling them all the way through. And so we can learn what happened in prehistory and right after the flood, and actually many other accounts throughout history, to understand how the end time is going to come about. And have a bit of a saying, it's the in the antediluvian world they had the Nephilim world order, and I think the NWO that everybody talks about for the end time might be more accurately described as the Nephilim world order as opposed to the New World Order.
Yes.
That's just sort of one of my idiosyncrasies.
Yes, absolutely. And just to catch people up to speed, in the last two shows that Gary and I have done, we covered in great detail the antediluvian age and its connections to the earth becoming without form and void, destroyed, and how in Genesis you have a restoration and a recreation of the earth. And so we're going to pick it up there. And go ahead, Gary, I want to give you a chance to speak about how these 7 secret sciences were brought forth. And we'll start with the modern era, the fall of humanity, and then the birth of the 2 bloodlines, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent.
Sure. And most people will maybe not be aware of what the 7 sacred sciences are in terms of how it plays a significant part in prehistory, but they'll know the names of those sciences because they're being developed again today, and everybody's taught them in university. But the core to the 7 sacred sciences and the mythology, it goes back to what the craft legends talk about, and Freemasonry is absolutely inundated with prehistory and the development of these 7 sacred sciences. So for the most part, I base a lot of what I have to say about the 7 sacred sciences from the craft legends, and then sort of bring the context around in the book and in interviews when I'm talking about it as to how those sciences manifested themselves. And so as it goes, is Adam was taught all this knowledge in Eden, but after the fall, he continues to practice and teach the 7 sacred sciences, and he teaches them obviously to Cain, one of his sons, and Abel is murdered by Cain, and then Cain is ostracized, and then Adam also continues to teach it to Seth. So we have the progression and the applications of these sciences taken on by 2 different people, and they'll take 2 different forms. And so Cain in turn teaches his first son Enoch, as opposed to Enoch, son of Jared, in the Sethite line. So let's not confuse the 2 here. And so Cain and Enoch develop these 7 sacred sciences, but they start to develop them in a way that is designed not to respect the God of the universe or to honor him in any way or to honor him as the creator of the universe and to lead people astray. And then they pervert these sciences to honor their God, which is the great architect of the universe, and or Satan or Lucifer or whatever you would like to call him, and the fallen angels that followed them. And so they develop a mystical religion and secret societies to house these sciences and to keep them away from who they feel are mundane and not worthy of understanding these knowledges, including how you become immortal in these sciences.
Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Welcome, everybody. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here on freedomslips.com. And I'm honored to have as guest with me for the next 2 evenings author Gary Wayne, who's written and released a 814-page, I believe, book, a compendium on the ancient mysteries and prophecies and mythologies of the world and how they come together in underlying truth. I most certainly recommend it to people if you've not had a chance to get it and to read through. It certainly is a task to read through it. I've been reading it for several weeks now, and I only reached page 400 or so. So, Gary, are you there?
I am, and so excited to be back on your show tonight again, Zen.
I'm looking forward to it, and like yourself, I've had received a lot of good feedback from everybody, and everybody seems to be excited when we get together to share fellowship, and so looking forward to the ongoing series.
Yeah, should be good. Should be very good.
Excellent. Well, before we get started, let me give you a chance to give out your website contact information and where people can go to support your work.
So if somebody is looking to purchase my book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind, it's available through Amazon.com and all Amazon sites around the world. It's available through BarnesandNoble.com and through their stores that can be ordered through there. It is also available on most online websites, and it's also available in Kindle format, also available through Christian bookstores, as it's distributed by Ingram's and Sun the Light Distribution, and thereby you can order it through an independent store as well. If somebody wants a personalized autographed version of my book, go to my website. That's www.genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6, conspiracy.com. And you can go to buy from author or buy now, buy from author, and I can personalize it in any way that you wish to. And there's also generous excerpts of my book on the website if you're interested in viewing it a little bit deeper before maybe purchasing. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Gary Wayne 63. That's at Gary Wayne 63. And also on Facebook, I have a Gary Wayne page and then 2 Genesis 6 conspiracy pages. And if you do get a hold of me, I will get back to you.
Excellent. Well, I have another question for you as far as your radio interviews, because I know that you do a number